Hello, and welcome to another episode of Foss Company's Tax Credits Today. My name is Jennifer Pruett. I'm a VP of Investments, and my role is to assist corporate investors who are interested in strategically redirecting tax dollars into historic rehabilitation and renewable energy projects in exchange for a variety of important benefits, including tax credits. It's fair to say that over the past several months, we have witnessed an intense election season, and there has been much speculation as to how the new administration might impact tax policy. Today, I am joined by Bryen Alperin, partner and managing director at Foss Company. Bryen helms the renewable energy and sustainable technologies platform here at Foss and has written and spoken often on this topic. Also joining us is Andrew Silverman, a senior tax analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence in New York. I am thrilled to have both of you here to share your perspective. I thought we might start with one piece of legislation that has been top of mind in conversations with investors, the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA. Bryen and Andrew, can each of you comment on how the election outcome might impact the IRA and overall tax policy? I realize this is a broad question, so perhaps you can address a couple of key concerns like the likelihood of a full repeal or whether there are specific elements that are deemed vulnerable. I also think it would be important to address whether any unraveling of the IRA might be retroactive in nature. So Bryen, maybe we start with you and then we can turn to Andrew.
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, happy to discuss this. And I'll let Andrew fill in some of the details here. But I think, high level, we're expecting that there could be aspects of the IRA that get adjusted. I think the consensus in the industry is that it's more of a fine tuning and scalpel approach versus a wholesale repeal. So we're looking at, what sections could be up for negotiation if the IRA is on the table. And, it's probably part of the reconciliation process that may occur next year as part of the tax discussions around the extension of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act. And Republicans will be looking at, how to free up funds to pay for some of those, expensive tax cuts that they're looking to extend. So looking at the IRA, there's certain credits that might be more at risk of just being eliminated entirely. I'll be, interested to get Andrew's take on this, but there's been talk about certain credits like the EV tax credits, the EV charging infrastructure credits, potentially being eliminated entirely. There's also been a lot of talk about a sunsetting of the ITCs and PTCs in a more accelerated fashion than they're, currently slated for. So right now we have, a long, almost 10-year runway for those credits, and perhaps they could be sunset, faster than that over, 2-3 years or something like that, which would be a return to, sort of normal for the industry. We've, for many years, had a sunset of these credits a few years in the future that would continuously get extended. So, that type of a scenario, I don't think would be too concerning, although it does impact some, investors and developers' ability to do long-term planning. We do prefer to have longer term certainty. There's also risk that certain aspects of these credits like adders or direct pay might get adjusted. We might see additional requirements added, like additional domestic content requirements. There could be additional restrictions around foreign entities of concern, for example. So if you're buying advanced manufacturing credits, even though the equipment was manufactured in the US, if that manufacturer has Chinese ownership, will those credits potentially be disallowed? Those types of things. So, we expect there could be some changes there. There's also in 2025, we're going to see the tech neutral tax credits phasing in. So these are, the new ITC and PTC tax credits that have some additional requirements attached to them. And, some guidance has been issued on those, but we could see guidance reissued or amended that might adjust those credits. So a lot of developers are thinking about trying to safe harbor their projects into the existing tax credit regime by starting construction on their projects in 2024 to avoid any potential negative changes that might occur with those tech neutral credits or other changes in 2025. So there's a big safe harboring effort going on with a lot of developers right now. And so we'd expect that even if there were negative changes because of all that safe harboring, we have at least a couple of years of projects with plenty of credits ahead of us, hopefully longer than that. So I think some of the other changes that could be more impactful near term might be things like tariff announcements or changes in the tax rate. But just the general uncertainty that all of this creates can also be a challenge as investors are trying to forecast what their tax liabilities are and determine what amount of credits they're looking to buy for the year. So it may impact investors' ability to commit to, say, 2026 tax credits if there's significant uncertainty on the table. So I'll turn it over to Andrew.
Yeah, Bryen, I would agree with all of the points you made. And going back to whether the outcome of the election has an impact on the IRA or tax policy makes me think about something that Barack Obama used to like to say in his first term, especially to House Republicans. He used to say, well, so I just do a very good Obama impression, but he used to say, elections have consequences. And that's certainly the case with this election. Voters may not know that they were deciding the fate of Trump's tax cuts, otherwise known as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, when they voted earlier this month. But that's exactly what they were doing. And if the Democrats had swept Congress and the White House, the TCJA would almost certainly have been left to phase out. So I think there's no question that the Republicans, maybe I call it their bugbear, the Inflation Reduction Act, will be rolled back with Republicans in charge. At the same time, I think it's definitely an overstatement to say that all of the clean energy tax perks are going to be repealed outright. Bryen was absolutely right about that. But then, he mentioned the EV tax credit. The Trump administration just recently announced that the EV tax credit was going to be completely repealed. So doesn't that suggest the Republicans are going to go big on repealing clean energy tax credits? I think the answer to that question is no. And I think that for several reasons. The first, I think it's kind of intuitive for policy folks, which is that when these proposals get aired, I think they're more about measuring the public response, or maybe even the response within the Beltway in DC, than it is about actually making policy pronouncements. I mean, I think if the Republicans were just going to repeal the EV tax credit, they would just repeal the EV tax credit. They certainly wouldn't announce it months in advance to give people ample opportunity to shoot it down. Also, if a branch of government is going to get rid of clean energy tax credits, it's not going to be the president or even the new DOGE Commission or Treasury. Congress has to do it. So if we assume that the announcement is in fact a statement of the Trump administration's position, then I think announcing it is simply a way of pushing the White House's position. And the best way to negotiate with Congress is to push for the most aggressive position first, knowing that eventually it'll be scaled back. I'd also point out that the House Republicans have a plan for repealing the Inflation Reduction Act, and that plan is called the Limit, Save, Grow Act. That plan is limited in what it rolls back. Many of the clean energy credits remain in place. They don't get overturned completely. Mostly it's those extras that the Inflation Reduction Act put into place that would get rolled back. But the interesting thing about the Limit, Save, Grow Act is that it passed the Republican House barely, but it did. It never got voted on in the Senate. So I suspect, obviously, Democratic opposition to that, but I actually think that there was some Republican opposition to the bill as well. Chuck Grassley of Iowa, big supporter of wind energy and biofuel. The new Majority Leader John Thune, also a proponent for wind energy and biofuel as well. So it's possible that even there was some Republican opposition to that bill, and that's why it never came up. I would also point out that Republicans appear to be looking for revenue wherever they can find it. They talked about privatizing Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, essentially selling it to investors. They're trying to figure out how they can use tariffs to pay for tax cuts. And what I think that indicates is that congressional Republicans' plan isn't to use the IRA to entirely pay for extending or making the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent, that they're looking for a lot of other options. And I'd also point out that we're already getting rumblings from some House Republicans, the more conservative House Republicans, that a $4.5 trillion package making the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent is just too big. So if that sentiment gains steam, then they wouldn't even need to repeal the entire Inflation Reduction Act. And then you'd asked about retroactivity. And what I would say about that is that normally Congress doesn't like to act retroactively, especially when they're going to take back something that they've already granted. Now, on the other hand, if they're giving you something, then retroactivity is perfectly fine. So you often see, for example, in the tax extenders bills, that something will have expired and then 3 years later, they're like, oh, it's coming back again. And it's coming back again from 3 years hence, so it's often that you see something like that being granted retroactively, but taking something away, not so much. Now, in terms of regulations, there's a small differentiation I make there, that when you talk about regulations, sometimes a regulator will issue a notice saying, hey, just putting you all on notice, we're going to change the rules, and it might take 6 months, might take a year, we're going to do that. Sometimes they never do it. Sometimes they do, and then they make that regulation retroactive to the date of the notice, but you're already on notice. So that in and of itself, from the perspective of the regulators, isn't retroactive. They've already said, it's going to be as of this date, and then they issue the regulations as of that date, and so it is what it is. But normally statutes aren't like that they pass the bill, and then the statute applies either from that date, actually, which is less common, or the beginning of the tax year after the bill passes. And so retroactivity, not usually a big problem.
Bryen, I'd like to get your thoughts on retroactivity, specifically, what you've seen since being in the tax credit industry in particular, because that seems to come up often with investors. And then I would love to sort of compare and contrast the TCJA with the IRA, the costs to date, and what the projected costs might be as well. But Bryen, first, maybe get your thoughts on the retroactive nature of some of this legislation that's pending.
Yeah, happy to speak to that. So in the history of these federal tax credits, we haven't seen a retroactive change that was harmful to investors. I think the administrations have always understood that if there was some kind of a retroactive change, that would not just impact current investment, but might forever scare investors off of participating in these programs and inhibit their ability to use these tax credits in the future. And these tax credits have been, a favored tool of Congress in various forms for decades. So I think that there's a very low likelihood of some kind of a retroactive change, in the sense that if a project is already, say, placed in service and the credits are generated, we wouldn't expect a change in law to retroactively take those credits away or reduce the amount of credits. So that said, it is something we think about and assess in terms of our risk, structuring and mitigation. For a lot of investors, either investing in tax equity or tax credit purchases, there's negotiation around the change in law provisions of those agreements. And oftentimes there's tax insurance that investors will acquire as part of their investments or purchases that have change in law protections. And so I think it's, important for investors to be looking at that and understanding, exactly what they're covered on and what they're not covered on, and making sure that they're comfortable. But, as an example, on tax credit purchases, the change in law provisions of the tax insurance, we sometimes see them only covering change in law up into the placement and service of the project. So when the project comes online, we would say really the gold standard would be to get tax insurance coverage all the way through the actual transfer date of the credit. So, which can be different, if the project is turned on in December of 2024, the actual transfer of the tax credit won't occur until the tax filing date, which would be months later. And so, looking at that gap and thinking about it, how important it is to have change in law protection for that gap period is something we're advising investors on and very focused on for the transactions we're participating in. Though again, I think it's a very remote risk, but obviously one that we want to make sure we're comfortable that we've addressed.
Thanks, Bryen. So I would love to sort of compare and contrast the TCJA and the IRA. They've both been expensive. I think, Andrew, you've mentioned that the IRA has been more costly than anticipated, which is obviously good for people like us in the industry, because obviously it's doing what was intended to do, which was attract more capital into these programs. But I'd love to just sort of hear your perspective on the two sort of side by side and the associated costs.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think that talking about cost is sort of key. I think that's the crux of the issue, actually. So what we understand is the cost of making the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act entirely permanent is between about $4 and $6 trillion, depending on who you ask. But Congress doesn't have to spend $4 trillion or $6 trillion. They can decide they only want to spend $1 trillion, or they can decide they want to spend $2 trillion. And then the whole thing won't be made permanent, or they can extend the whole thing for a couple of years. That's going to be a heck of a lot less than $4 to $6 trillion. They can extend a part of it and make part of it permanent. If Congress does decide they do want to spend that $4 to $6 trillion, that's an entirely different discussion. Then, of course, if Congress decides to spend $16 trillion, which is what the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget says all of Trump's plans would cost, then that's an entirely different discussion. But honestly, I am not sure that Republicans know which way they want to go yet on that anyway. Jason Smith, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, probably knows where he wants to go, and Mike Crapo, who's going to be the head of the Finance Committee in the Senate next term, probably knows where he wants to go. But they probably won't know how the bulk of the party feels about this until they really get into hashing it out and they have to count heads. And that's not going to happen until next year at some point. So I think anyone telling you they know for sure exactly how this is going to go probably has no idea. But like I said, cost is absolutely key. And I think once we know how much Congress is willing to spend, then we will have a much better sense of how they're going to do it. And chief among these questions, of course, is the fate of the Inflation Reduction Act. And so, until we know how much they're going to spend, then we're not going to know what they're going to do with the Inflation Reduction Act. But the importance of the Inflation Reduction Act is that's a big chunk of cash. Now, originally, they estimated that the Inflation Reduction Act was going to actually produce $325 billion of revenue, and that includes the clean energy tax credits, which were estimated to cost between $350 and $370 billion when the IRA was scored by the Congressional Budget Office back in 2022. However, the Penn Wharton budget model estimated as of last April that the cost of the Inflation Reduction Act had ballooned to $1.045 trillion. So it went from bringing in $325 billion to costing over $1 trillion. And then when the government issued its annual estimate of tax expenditures earlier this year in the spring, in March, that report seemed to substantiate what Wharton had estimated. For example, the production tax credit was originally estimated to cost about $11.2 billion over a decade, and the investment tax credit was originally estimated to cost about $51 billion over that period. The Treasury Department's expenditures report from March has increased those estimates pretty substantially. The production tax credit, which I said was originally estimated to cost, and I keep checking this because I'm like, that can't possibly be the case, but the production tax credit, which was really originally estimated to cost $11.2 billion over a decade, is now estimated to cost $276.6 billion. That's a 2,400% increase over the original estimate. And the investment tax credit, which was originally estimated to cost about $51 billion, is now estimated to cost $148 billion. And that's 200% more than the original cost. That's actually a lot more than Wharton had estimated last year. Wharton had said that it thought that those two credits together were going to cost $263 billion over a decade. And that's more than, the production tax credit was 276.6, more than Wharton had estimated the two of them together were going to cost. And it's probably a lot more than that by now, because the Treasury report only estimated things as of September 31st of 2023. But so interestingly, Brookings did a really interesting session on tax policy in the Trump era recently. The panelists agreed that this cost disconnect about the IRA across the political spectrum is problematic, and that if Democrats had known how much this was all going to cost, then the IRA would have had a heck of a lot of a harder time actually passing. So why am I going into this in such great detail? Because I think that if the clean energy tax credits only cost $350 billion or $500 billion or something like that, then I think it makes it more likely that Congress would take an all or nothing approach towards the Inflation Reduction Act. Because if the clean energy credits are not worth a whole lot, then it doesn't really matter if they go away, right? I mean, but on the other hand, if they're not worth a lot, then why bother to repeal them? But we don't have that situation. What we have is that the clean energy credits are costing us a heck of a lot more than we originally estimated. So I think that means that Congress definitely targets them, but I think it can repeal portions of those credits and still get a whole bunch of revenue for the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And incidentally, that's what Congress said it was going to do, or at least the House said it was going to do in the Limit, Save, and Grow Act. So I think that is still the approach that Congress is going to take.
Thank you. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit and have you both reflect on tariffs. Bryen, maybe you can share what sort of impact tariffs might have on the tax credit industry.
Sure. Yeah, I think when we look at what impact they can have, we've in the past had the industry, stalled by even the threat of a retroactive tariff or something like that, even before it goes into effect. It can create a lot of challenges. So just the announcement of potential future tariffs, especially if those potential future tariffs could be retroactive once they come into effect, I think could have a chilling effect on the number of projects that are reliant on, equipment that would be impacted. So probably a lot of, in the solar industry and battery storage industry, there's certainly a lot of domestic content that is ramping up, but the amount of manufacturing domestically is still, nowhere near the amount of equipment that's needed for all the projects that are trying to get built. So there's, a lot of equipment that could be at risk depending on what those tariffs look like. And, I don't think we're just talking about China necessarily. I mean, there's been talks about, Mexico as well. So, it'd be interesting to see how this all plays out, but that could have an impact. So I think for investors, it becomes all the more important to understand the status of projects that you're committing to. Typically, we're not committing actual or funding capital until these projects are actually built. So we're not necessarily taking financial risk, but there is sort of the risk of projects slipping or just no longer being viable that you were expecting to be completed. And so you end up not getting as many tax credits as you were anticipating for the year. So it's not a financial loss, but sort of an opportunity cost there if you've spent a lot of time diligencing these projects and then they never come to fruition. So that's something for investors to focus on and maybe ask some, more detailed questions about the status of the equipment and, what aspects of the project might be exposed to any tariffs that are announced. And, is it already being warehoused domestically or is it still, in transit?
So, yeah, I mean, I think I'm more of a tax guy than I'm a trade guy. So I guess that makes me more opposed to tariffs than I would be to taxes, because I think taxes are pretty targeted and you can sort of expect what the response is going to be with a tax you apply. With tariffs, it's pretty hard to predict what the response is going to be. I mean, we could put a tariff on China related to steel imports in the United States, and they put a tariff on us on soybeans or something like that. So you get these very sort of strange impacts that are unpredictable with a tariff as opposed to a tax. The other thing about tariffs, which the administration may not have taken into consideration when it started thinking about using a tariff in order to pay for tax cuts, for example, is that we're already hearing rumblings about this, that the Congressional Budget Office is probably not going to score a tariff the same way that they would score a tax. And by that, I mean value it. How much is this worth for tax cut purposes? So if you say, we're going to raise the corporate tax rate up a couple of points, something like that, then they say, okay, well, how's that going to impact things over a 10-year budget window? With a tariff, it's almost certain that the Congressional Budget Office is not going to say, oh, okay, you're going to put a 60% tariff on China. Great. That'll be worth X amount over 10 years. They're probably going to say, okay, how long is this tariff actually going to last? And in fact, the Trump administration has said that these tariffs are not going to last forever. They're going to be temporary. So we actually don't know how much a tariff is going to be worth in terms of paying for tax cuts, because we don't know how long the Congressional Budget Office thinks that the tariff is going to remain in place. It could be 3 years, 5 years, maybe 10 years, but it's probably going to be less than legislators would hope. And so if you think you're going to get $500 billion out of tariffs, you're probably not. So I think that makes them a lot less appealing, at least to the tax folks, than a tax increase, for example, would be.
Great. So let's discuss the corporate tax rate. Currently, it's at 21%, but there have been instances when Trump was on the campaign trail where he declared he'd like to reduce it to 15%. It's my understanding that this reduction would only apply to a segment of corporate America, but I thought, perhaps both of you could reflect on that. I think it has come up in conversation, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
You're absolutely right. That 50% rate was not intended to be across the board from what we understand. And to be honest, as a political candidate, Donald Trump wasn't super duper clear, but I think that makes sense because candidates, as Mario Cuomo used to say, they campaign in poetry and govern in prose. So that 50% rate, it seems to apply just to domestic production. So that reduced rate probably only applies to U.S. manufacturers. But generally speaking, a lower corporate tax rate means that tax credits aren't worth as much. They're sheltering a smaller amount of tax. And I actually think that the corporate tax rate is likely to go up a bit because there are going to be some Republicans that are fiscal hawks. So that could actually be good for the tax credit industry.
Bryen, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know that my crystal ball is any better than Andrew's on what way the tax rate may go. I think we've heard arguments that it's slated to be reduced in some fashion, but also that there may be support on the Senate to increase it to help pay for other aspects of the Tax Cut Jobs Act or other spending that may be important. So I think there's just some uncertainty there right now, and so for investors, I think it's important we do this anyway, but just kind of emphasizing that you should be looking at what that change in tax rate could do on any tax equity investments you're making. So, a tax credit purchase is just tax credits typically, so not going to be significantly impacted by the tax rate change other than just impacting your total federal liability and how many tax credits you can buy for the year. With a tax equity investment, typically you're picking up a significant amount of depreciation benefits over the life of the project. And many times that's, front loaded in the first few years. So if you've closed transactions, say, this year or last year that still have significant depreciation benefits remaining, those could be impacted by a change in the tax rate. So a reduction in the tax rate could hurt the return slightly by reducing the benefits you get on the depreciation. However, I think that would be largely a timing issue because typically in these transactions, you also, when you're exiting, you have a capital gain at exit. And so it would potentially also reduce your liability at exit. So those two may largely offset each other. But it's sort of a modeling exercise to see what the impact could be future transactions. And so when we're structuring a tax equity investment, it's part of why we try to limit the amount of liability that we have on the capital gain at exit is, a potential increase in the tax rate could actually hurt us there. So it's just another piece to think about with these tax equity transactions.
Thanks, Bryen. Andrew, I would love to hear your thoughts on the so-called office dynamics amongst Senate and House members. Obviously, that can be a big factor in influencing tax policy. So I thought you might be able to share your perspective there.
Yes, this is the fun stuff. Congress and the parties within Congress are not monolithic. I think a great recent example of the push and pull of personalities in Washington is the recent election of the majority leader in the Senate. Trump, if you remember, was pushing pretty hard for Rick Scott to be chosen for majority leader. And Rick Scott lost almost right off the bat. Why did that happen? I think for a few reasons. The Senate likes to demonstrate its independence, and Republican senators mostly, maybe in the House it's different. In fact, I know in the House it's different, but Republican senators are mostly not MAGA, so-called MAGA Republicans. John Thune, the senator that the Republicans chose, is a Republican in the McConnell model. And I don't know if you know this, but McConnell entered the Senate on Ronald Reagan's coattails in 1984. So he's a Ronald Reagan Republican. And Thune was just a heck of a lot more popular than Rick Scott. And you know how they say that elections aren't popularity contests? Well, this one was a popularity contest. And Rick Scott admitted that he didn't even know most of his fellow Republican senators. So what this tells us is that when it comes down to it, Congress is just a bunch of people, and people are going to do what people are going to do. Sometimes people vote against their own interests and those are their constituents, but most of the time they're going to do what's best for them and their constituents. And egos are easily bruised in Washington. I don't want to call representatives divas, but I mean, it's not super far off. Our Bloomberg reporters in Washington told us that the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in the House, Jason Smith, and the left-leaning Democratic senator who leads the tax committee in the Senate, Ron Wyden, get along super well. They negotiated a bipartisan tax compromise together that would have exchanged a handful of valuable corporate tax perks for a larger child tax credit and a boosted low-income housing credit. But that bill never made it to a vote. Why? Well, we understand that the ranking member, the second highest person on the Finance Committee, Mike Crapo, who's about to be the head of the committee next term, didn't like the compromise. He balked at a larger child tax credit. And Jason Smith, we understand, was very put off by this rejection of his bill. He views this as a slight. So relations between the next head of the Senate Tax Committee, Crapo, and the next head of the House Tax Committee, Smith, are, as a result, at this point, pretty frosty. And that's going to make it harder for Senate Republicans and House Republicans to work together on a future Tax Cuts and Jobs Act bill. Smith is a big Trump supporter, the youngest ever to chair the Ways and Means Committee. Crapo has been in the Senate for 25 years, much longer than Donald Trump has been in politics, and has been waiting a really long time to chair the Finance Committee. And I think that's not so different from the House and the Senate as a whole. The House is up for re-election every 2 years. That makes them notably more Trumpy. That the Senate is up every 6 years. So that insulates them somewhat from the president as well as voters. So just because Republicans have a majority in both chambers of Congress and Trump is in the White House doesn't necessarily mean that negotiations between the Republicans are going to be a walk in the park. There's going to be some disagreement, some bumps in the road, and maybe there'll be a lot of disagreement, but eventually we think that they will be able to come to an agreement. It's just not going to be a straight path.
Excellent. Thanks for your insights there. Finally, Bryen, I wanted to turn to you and see if you had any advice or strategies for tax credit buyers amidst this sort of uncertainty around potential legislative changes.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. And, we touched on some as we went, but I think in general, you're thinking about the, risk on credits you're buying and currently investing in. Again, there's, I'd say, a very low risk of the retroactive change, but it's still something to think about in terms of tax insurance and making sure you understand what risks you are and aren't taking. Thinking about the potential change in a tax rate, up or down, and what that might do to returns in your transactions that you're looking at. You may also want to look at the types of credits that you're focusing on. Again, it's, I think for anything that's placed in service already, it's unlikely that the credit would be taken away. But if you're focusing a lot of effort on, closing a transaction and then it ends up, never generating the credits, there's some opportunity costs there. So diversifying potentially into some other credits, ones that may be less at risk, that might have more bipartisan support, could be a good strategy. So, we have a lot of investors that have been focusing on some of the new credits, like the advanced manufacturing credits, 45X, and just getting a more diversified pool of different types of credits in their portfolios for the year. And then, for us, I think long-term strategy wise, we've over the last couple of years really put an emphasis on aligning ourselves and building relationships with what we see as kind of best-in-class sponsors and developers for these projects, and especially those that have access to domestic content. And so some of our leading sponsor partners have been able to secure, exclusive access to large amounts of domestically manufactured equipment, which I think will help them, fare well through any changes, or at least better than the competition. And so those types of relationships hopefully will lead to, continued availability of tax credits for our investors going into the future. But thinking about the types of sponsors you're building those relationships with, and making sure that the amount of credits you're looking for in the future hopefully will be available and you'll have access to that kind of supply. So, and then, I would say that working with advisors on making sure you're navigating all this is a good idea. I mean, we've been around for over 40 years and have been through many cycles and many changes to these tax credit programs. We're very well versed in, sort of the safe harboring of credits and how to, structure our transactions around potential future changes. So that kind of expertise, I think, is, hopefully very valuable for investors.
Agreed. I mean, obviously the landscape continues to evolve and it does present challenges, but opportunities. So, Bryen, would you mind sharing some of the opportunities that you're seeing in the short term, perhaps the next few months or year, that investors might be able to capitalize on?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jennifer. So, we're continuing to see a lot of project opportunities in, what we'll call kind of the traditional tax equity space, solar and wind and battery storage. We're also seeing an increasing amount of tax credits coming from some, the newer technologies that are at least newer in the sense that they're qualifying for tax credits in ways that they hadn't before. So things like RNG projects, advanced manufacturing, and some of these credits, et cetera. So there are opportunities, I think, to diversify tax credit portfolios. There's also, I would say, for the more experienced investors, some opportunistic situations where they might be able to get some slightly higher returns. So, for example, I think that there's over the next 6 months or so, likely some uncertainty around all the future potential changes to the tax code, and that may cause many investors to hesitate on new commitments, at least further out in the future, like 2026. So I would say that those investors that are confident enough in their tax position may be able to lock in some purchases for 2026 and beyond that discounts. And you wouldn't necessarily need to be paying for those credits upfront, and you'd also likely have in the conditions for payment on those credits, you'd have change in law and other protections. So, you could make a sort of a strategic future commitment on future streams of credits and maybe lock in some preferential pricing and take advantage of some of the current market uncertainty there. And I think that, that applies both for the transfer credits as well as tax equity. We're also seeing, in the tax equity space, a variety of new structures that are emerging, as many of the new entrants into the market are looking to just buy credits on a transferable basis, but many sponsors and developers prefer to have an actual, partner in the deal that's entering into an equity investment, and taking depreciation from the projects. So many of investors are now looking at, different tax equity structures where instead of retaining all of the credits, they may choose to enter a tax equity partnership and then sell a portion or even all of the tax credits out of that transaction, which can have the effect of, reducing the amount of capital that they need to put into that transaction and therefore boost the ROI that they're earning on those deals. Sort of like, leveraging their investment, but it's being leveraged by the credit sale and selling down the credit. So there's a lot of new interesting structures emerging and opportunistic situations. We've also seen some, I'll call kind of fire sale situations of tax credits where in the transferable market, you're required to transfer these credits by the tax filing date. And so as those tax filing dates approach, there's sometimes projects that for whatever reason had failed to sell their credits. And so we'll see some deep discounts available in the market for those investors that are prepared to move quickly. And so we've worked with some investors to, set up fund structures so that everything is in place and ready to go. And they can actually capitalize on those types of situations, and close rapidly, if presented with a good opportunity on a short timeline.
Excellent summary. Thank you. We hope our listeners remain proactive and stay informed in order to successfully navigate these changes. And we would encourage you to reach out to members of the Foss team for further insights and guidance. Andrew and Bryen, thank you very much for joining today. And that concludes our episode.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer.